again, I have my PsyD, so I had to do the whole dissertation game. And I had created this rule in my head that if I finished my dissertation, then that meant I had to be done grieving. And I think this statement, you don't have to wait for your grief to end before you're allowed to thrive. That's something I needed to think through and integrate for myself, right? I could finish my dissertation and still grieve. I could have this success and still miss my brother. I didn't have to be done grieving that.
Welcome to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, a licensed psychologist and grief specialist, here to help change the conversation about grief and build community and connection while we all adjust to this new normal we are living in. This podcast is for you if you are grieving or if you are supporting someone in a season of grief. I'm glad you're here.
Hey friends, welcome back to Grief is the New Normal. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and this is part 4, the final episode in our mini-series for clinician coaches and helpers living and working through grief. And this one is called Living with It, because sometimes grief doesn't pass. Actually, yeah, this one is called Living with It, because what do we know about grief? It doesn't go away. It just gets different. And sometimes it doesn't soften for a long time. Sometimes it changes you and the way you do the work permanently. So today we're going to talk about what it means to live with grief while still doing this work, sustainable grief-informed practices, not just for the crisis, but for the long haul, how to honor your limits without abandoning your clients or your calling, and how to build a grief-honoring identity as a clinician without apology. So let's get into it. So let's be honest, grief doesn't end. It does not go away. You don't just process it and go back to who you were before. You carry it. You adapt around it. You keep showing up with cracks in your heart and a fuller understanding of what it means to hurt and help at the same time. But that's not what most clinical models prepare us for, is it? What if you're still grieving years later and still a damn good therapist, coach, or helper? What if your grief has changed your work? And that's okay, because living with grief as a clinician doesn't mean you're always raw, you're emotionally leaky, you can't hold space for others, you're stuck. It means you are deeply attuned to loss. It means you recognize that healing is not linear, grief as part of the human condition, not something to pathologize, and you can hold more nuance, more silence, and more contradiction. Grief does not make you less capable. It makes you more courageous. It softens your lens and sharpens your clarity. It anchors your practice in something real. Story time with Heather. I think for me, I didn't just become a grief therapist. I became a therapist who lives with grief. Yes, grief is what brought me into this field in the first place. Losing my brother almost 17 years ago, I really struggled to figure out what grief was, because again, we didn't talk about it. We live in this very grief phobic, grief illiterate society, especially back in 2009. There just wasn't stuff out there to help me figure out how to navigate it. And the clinicians I was trying to work with, they didn't know what to do with me. And so I went back to school to become the grief therapist that I needed. And along the way, I learned how to integrate my grief into my story. I say this all the time, grief doesn't go away. It just gets different. We learn how to carry it differently through different seasons. It is part of us. We don't just get over what happened. We learn how to carry it and move through it and integrate it into who we are now. We're not going back to who we were, because grief changes us. It has changed us so deeply and has sharpened so much of what we believe and how we hold space for this pain that's coming into our offices. And I think I'm a better human and a better clinician because I know what it means to live with grief. I have integrated it into who I am. And so often people are like, "Oh, have you accepted it? How long did it take you to accept it?" And I think I can accept that I've changed, but I don't typically use acceptance-based language in my clinical work or in my grief trainings, because acceptance can have this positive connotation that we're okay with what happened. And more often than not, we're not okay with it. And so I think looking at it from a grief integration model, a grief integration lens, feels more attuned to how I live out my grief, how I am a therapist that lives with grief. So for you who are listening, thinking about sustainable grief holding practices, you are living with grief and still doing this work. So we need something sustainable. We need realistic scheduling, like especially having understandings of the cadence of grief and how different seasons can be more activating around grief. So trying to not overbook our emotional bandwidth, right? So having that realistic scheduling. In November, I tend to see less clients because that's a very griefy month for me. Okay, so what are some things that we need to have this sustainable grief holding practice? Because again, it's not going to go away. It's just going to get different. It's going to keep coming up. We talk about, again, love a metaphor, right? So thinking about the waves metaphor. So you are standing on the beach, right? And you're standing in the water. Once you've experienced this loss, it's almost like you've taken this step out into the ocean, this griefy ocean, and you are getting rammed by waves over and over again, especially in the beginning. They're super acute. They are frequent. They just keep coming. And over time, it's not that you've stepped out of the water, because we live in the griefy water now, but the intensity and acuity of the waves, the frequency of the waves gets reduced. It's almost like someone's taking the ends of those waves and stretching it out and lengthening how frequently they're coming. So they're more gradual. Maybe we can see them coming more. Every now and then we get a sneak attack wave, which are grief bursts. That's going to keep happening. And again, it's not that we're moving backwards or taking steps back in our grief, in our story. It's just more that sometimes unexpected things show up, or maybe we haven't been taking care of ourselves the way that we need to. And so we're being more impacted by things around us. And sometimes just grief wants some space. So it just pops up. So that's why we have those sneak attack waves. But in thinking about understanding the seasonal cadence of grief, like for me, in November, I tend to schedule less clients because that's my griefier, heavier month. And I want to make sure that I have the capacity to hold for my clients. And so I'm trying to not overbook my emotional bandwidth, right? I maybe schedule a little less in my personal life, socially, so that I'm having enough reserves to take care of myself during the week so I can be an effective clinician. Another thing to think about, clinical variety. We do not want too many griefy clients at once because that can hit too hard. So thinking about a variety in our schedule. So being intentional with that cadence, right? Too many griefy clients, too many trauma clients at once can hit too hard. We want some variety. We want a spectrum of clients that we're working with, and even trying to be intentional with how we're scheduling them throughout the day. I talk about this with my pre-licensed clinicians often is if you want to be a grief therapist, a trauma therapist, awesome. And if you have some more complicated stories, complicated clients, trying to not schedule them back to back, or being intentional with how you're framing your day with your scheduling, I think can be really important, because then we're showing up better. Our clients are getting a better version of ourselves because we're not wrecked. And yes, we can't always control our schedules. And if we can, let's try to, because then that makes it more sustainable for us to do this work long term. I actually took a break from clinical work for a couple of years. I started doing clinical work in 2012 and did it for 8 years. Grief and trauma heavy most days. And I was burned out. I needed a chance to recharge and reset. And so I moved to the other side of things for a little bit. Ironically, January 2020, I started doing a 100% remote behavioral health case manager position. So I was still in the field, but on the backside of things, I wasn't doing therapeutic work because I needed a break. I was fried and I needed to do something different for a little bit. So giving yourself permission to change up what you're doing, having that clinical variety. So then when I came back to private practice, I was more intentional with how I scheduled out my days and tried to think through what made the most sense for me, because I do work with pretty complicated clients, but I want to be intentional with how I'm scheduling them so that I can offer them that good care. And number 3, we want to think about ethics that include our well-being, right? You are part of the equation. Yes, we always want to make sure we're doing our best to have an ethical practice and provide ethical care. And we need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves within that. We are part of that math. And this isn't about being high functioning while grieving. And Trust me, I get it. I love to play the high functioning overachiever game. That is one of my default modes when I am stressed out, is I add more to my plate. And so it's working on retraining myself to not do that. It's about creating a practice that makes space for your grief on purpose, because it's part of your story, and your story informs your presence, your boundaries, and your brilliance. We're not able to be our best, most brilliant, authentic selves if we are burnt out, if we are struggling. And so how do we integrate those griefy pieces of our story into ourselves and into our care so we can keep doing this? So let me say this. Clinicians who live with grief are changing the field. We're naming the invisible weight. We're challenging the polished performative model of professionalism. We are redefining what regulation looks like. We're giving our clients permission to not be okay. We're not doing it for praise. We're doing it because we've been there, to know what it's like to cry between sessions, to question our calling, to wonder if we're holding too much or not enough, and to show up anyway, to say, this hurts and I'm still here. As we start to wrap up to the part 4 of our supporting clinicians, coaches, and healers grieving in a grieving world, here are some closing reflections and takeaways. You don't have to wait for your grief to end before you're allowed to thrive. This one's so tricky, right? I'm going to just share a story because that's what I do, and I think stories are helpful. I had created this. So again, I have my PsyD, so I had to do the whole dissertation game. And I had created this rule in my head that if I finished my dissertation, then that meant I had to be done grieving. And I think this statement, you don't have to wait for your grief to end before you're allowed to thrive, that's something I needed to think through and integrate for myself, right? I could finish my dissertation and still grieve. I could have this success and still miss my brother. I didn't have to be done grieving that. So thinking through that for yourselves. You don't owe anyone a performance of healing. What you and your grief, you can do that behind closed doors. You don't have to perform it on social media or start a grief podcast or whatever it is. You don't owe anyone a performance for your healing. And you get to create a professional life that honors your humanity and your grief. So got 3 little questions. We've done that each episode. So here's your final reflection for this series. So number 1, what part of your work has been reshaped by your grief and can that be a source of strength? Number 2, what would it look like to create a sustainable grief-informed practice? And 3, what stories about being a good enough therapist or a good enough coach or a good enough doula are you ready to let go of? This series has just been such a meaningful one to record. And if it's resonated for you, I'd love to hear how grief has shaped your work or how you're making space for it now. And if you are a grieving clinician, coach, or care provider, please know this. You are not grieving wrong. You are not working wrong. And you are not alone. So take care of your limits, your legacy, and your grief. Remember to be kind to yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Take care.
That's it for today's episode of Grief is the New Normal. If this conversation resonated with you or you think it might benefit someone else, please share it. Sharing can open doors to healing, understanding, and normalizing these griefy conversations. If you're craving deeper insights or ongoing support, consider signing up to help you navigate your grief journey. Visit the website www.griefisthenewnormal.com to subscribe. For those who prefer a more personal touch to their healing process, check out my grief journal, Authentically Unapologetic. It's designed to help you explore your grief on your own terms with prompts and exercises that encourage reflection and growth. I'm Dr. Heather Taylor, and I look forward to our next meaningful conversation. If you're interested in sharing your story, collaborating, or learning more, please email me at hello@griefisthenewnormal.com. You can also stream the episodes on YouTube for more engaging content. Until next time, keep exploring your grief with intention and support, remembering you don't have to do this alone.